Good day and welcome back to learning about the English language literary periods. My part one that I've already published goes through from the Latin literature all the way up to English language literature since 1900. So if you're looking for the Romantic period, if you're looking for Beowulf and the early English periods, all of the Jacobean and the Elizabethan periods, those are all my part one. You've come here today though to learn about English language literature since 1900. Now, with our English language literature since 1900, the major lyric poet of the first decades of the 20th century was Thomas Hardy, who concentrated on poetry after the harsh response to his last novel, Jude the Obscure. Now, from around 1910, the modernist movement began to influence English literature, whereas their Victorian predecessors had usually been happy to cater to mainstream middle-class people. Now, the 20th century writers often felt alienated from it, and they responded by writing more intellectually challenging works or by pushing the boundaries of acceptable content. Now, major poets of this period in Britain included American-born T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and the Irishman William Butler Yeats. Also at this time period for modernist movements, free verse and other stylistic innovations came to the forefront in this era. Now, the experiences of the First World War were reflected in the work of war poets such as Wilfred Owen and others. Many writers turned away from patriotic and imperialist themes as a result of the war, notably in the author Rudyard Kipling. We also have important novelists between the two world wars that include the Irish writer James Joyce, as well as D.H. Lawrence, C.S. Forester, Enid Blyton, P.G. Wodehouse, E.M. Forster, and Virginia Woolf. Now, James Joyce's increasingly complex works included Ulysses, an interpretation of the Odyssey set in Dublin. But Lawrence wrote with understanding about the social life of the lower and middle classes and the personal life of those who could not adapt to the social norms of his time. He attempted to explore human emotions more deeply than his contemporaries and challenged the boundaries of the acceptable treatment of sexual issues in works such as Lady Chatterley's Lover. Now, Virginia Woolf was an influential feminist and a major stylistic innovator associated with the stream of consciousness technique. Her novels included To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Dalloway, and The Waves. Novelists who wrote in a more traditional style such as John Galsworthy and Arnold Bennett continued to receive great acclaim in the interwar period. At the same time, the Georgian poets maintained a more conservative approach to poetry. Now, one of the more significant English writers of this interwar period was George Orwell. An acclaimed essayist and novelist, Orwell's works are considered among the most important social and political commentaries of the 20th century. Dealing with issues such as poverty in the Road to Wigan Pier and Down and Out in Paris and London, he deals with totalitarianism in 1984 and colonialism in Burmese days. Now, George Orwell's works were often semi-autobiographical, and in the case of Homage to Catalonia, wholly autobiographical. We also see the author Agatha Christie. She's writing English crime novels, short stories, and plays, and is best remembered for her 80 detective novels and her successful West End theater plays. Her works, particularly featuring detectives Hercule Poirot and Miss Jane Marple, have given her the title of the Queen of Crime and made her one of the most important and innovative writers in the development of the genre, with some of her most famous works being The Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile. Moving into the leading poets of the middle and late 20th century, these would include the traditionalist John Bejetman, Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes, and the Northern Irish Catholic Seamus Heaney, who lived in the Republic of Ireland for much of his later life. Major British novelists of the middle and later 20th century include satirist Evelyn Waugh, Henry Green, Anthony Powell, William Golding, Anthony Burgess, Kingsley Amis, V.S. Naipaul, Graham Greene, Frederick Forsyth, Roald Dahl, Arthur C. Clarke, J.G. Ballard, and Iris Murdoch. But when we get to the turn of the 21st century, we include the major writers Philip Pullman, Salman Rushdie, Neil Gaiman, Ian McEwan, Alan Moore, Terry Pratchett, and J.K. Rowling. Now, in drama, the drawing room plays of the post-war period were challenged in the 1950s by the angry young men, which were exemplified as John Osborne's iconic play, Look Back in Anger. Also in the 1950s, the bleak absurdist play, Waiting for Godot, by the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, profoundly affected British drama. So when we look at these general development stages of the English literature in England and the major representatives on each stage, I haven't really covered what any of these pieces are. What I'm basically doing is telling you who was considered important in the time period itself and perhaps those that you might be studying academically. So when we look at the Old English period, you might want to remember our national epic of Beowulf. You might want to look at the historical background and the literature in this period. So again, when you look at the historical background for this period, you're going to be looking at the Celts or the Britons as they're starting to establish their kingdoms, the Roman conquest that comes in, and the Anglo-Saxon or English conquest that comes shortly after the Romans leave, and the influence of Anglo-Saxons' religious beliefs and Christianity on English literature. So when you're looking at the literature in this period, you're going to look at the representatives of this historical background. And again, the literary masterwork in this period would be known as Beowulf. Now, when we look at the Celts or the Britons in the historical background, the earliest settlers of the British Isles came around about 600 BC, and about 400 BC, a branch of the Celts or the Britons started to settle, and that's how the island got its name of Britain, the land of the Britons. Now, with the Roman conquest at about 55 BC, Britain was invaded by Julius Caesar, the great Roman conqueror. And in 43 AD, Claudius, another Roman conqueror, conquered it again and stayed there till the beginning of the 5th century. But around 450 AD, the tribes of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, later simply known as the Anglo-Saxons, migrated from the continent and established many small kingdoms. And by the 7th century, these small kingdoms became the 3 larger kingdoms. Now, they themselves got into a united kingdom to settle down constant wars, and the kingdoms of England, or the land of Angles, was what they were called because the Angles were the most numerous of the 3. Now, these 3 tribes mixed into a whole people called the English, and the language they used was called Anglo-Saxon or Old English. And so with this, the Anglo-Saxons' influence on religious beliefs and the Christianity that comes into our English literature is prevalent at this time. Now, after all, the Anglo-Saxons were a pagan or heathen people. They believed in the old mythology of Northern Europe, and so as you read through Beowulf, that's what you're going to see. Now, the form of literature is orally passed on at this time, so you're not going to see a lot of literature being written down. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent St. Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. So at this time, England was Christianized, and with the fast spread of Christian influence in classic learning, heathen poetry was slowly and steadily maneuvered out of the scene. Now, the earliest English books were being written down by monks in monasteries, and so they wrote down works that were passed on orally. However, they would tinge them with some Christian color. Now, as we look at literature in this period, there was a highlight in the development of the Anglo-Saxon literature called the Northumbrian School. Its center was the monasteries and the abbeys in the kingdom of Northumbria. For example, you'll see the Venerable Bede from 673 to 735, who was a monk that wrote in Latin, and his work, The Ecclesiastical History of England, earned him the title the Father of English History. We also, around this time period, around 670 AD, see Caedmon. He turned the stories in the Bible into verse form. So therefore, the title of the work, Paraphrase, or he's also known as the Father of the English Song, and his other 9-line poem is going to be called The Hymn. So when we look at the masterwork of this period, Beowulf, it probably existed in its oral form as early as the 6th century, and was written down in the 7th or 8th century, though the manuscript of it now dates back around to the 10th century. It contains altogether 3,182 lines, and the story in it is based partly on historical and partly on legendary materials. Now, the story takes place in Scandinavia rather than in England. When we look at the literary style, we call it an epic or the heroic poet. And an epic basically is a term that is a long narrative poem, which is composed in an elevated style and deals with the trials and achievements of a great hero or heroes. The epic also celebrates virtues of national, military, religious, cultural, political, or historical significance. Next is the literary position. It is the national epic of the Anglo-Saxons and the English people. When we look at its poetic features or devices, the poem is a mixture of paganism and Christian elements. We also want to look at the use of alliteration, the use of assonance, and the use of kenning. Now, the language that is used in Beowulf is Anglo-Saxon or Old English, which is very different from our modern English today. So thank you so much for stopping by to learn about English language after 1900 and as we started getting into the history of our English literature. Don't forget there is a part 1 that I did previously that walks you all the way through from Latin literature to 1900. If you have any questions or comments or would like to learn more about something from English language literature, go check out my other videos or leave a comment down below and let me know what else I can make a video on. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.